Welcome everybody to our webinar, From Konkan to Coromandel, Deccan Heritage, Art and Culture, co-hosted by the Deccan Heritage Foundation, the Centre of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, and the Bangalore International Centre. Today, we will be hearing from Professor Julia A.B. Hegewald. Professor Julia A.B. Hegewald graduated from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where she also obtained her PhD. After postdocs in Oxford and Heidelberg, she was lecturer and then reader at the University of Manchester. She is now professor and head of the Department of Asian and Islamic Art History at the University of Bonn. Besides other book publications, she's the author of Water Architecture in South Asia, A Study of Types, Developments and Meanings, 2002, Jaina Temple Architecture in India, The Development of a Distinct Language in Space and Ritual, 2009, and reprinted in 2018 in India, Jaina Tradition of the Deccan, Śrī-Vaiṣṇavas Muda Bidri Karkala, 2021, and the editor of the Jaina Heritage, Distinction, Decline, and Resilience, 2011. It is personally a great privilege to welcome Professor Hegewald because I have used her writings extensively, especially on Jain cosmological temples, which are very, very interesting and very important in my own research. After Professor Hegewald's lecture, we will be joined by Dr. Tiziana Lorenzetti, who we heard from a couple weeks ago in our webinar. This webinar goes with Professor Lorenzetti's webinar. Professor Lorenzetti is now the director of the International Institute of South Asian Studies in Rome. Today's lecture is entitled Reflections of Jaina and Vīra-Śaiva Interactions in the Art and Architecture of Karnataka. I request that you wait until the end of the lecture to type any questions in our chat box, which we will address after Professor Lorenzetti's comments on Professor Hegewald's talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hegewald.
Vivek, Dr. Vīra-Gupta, thank you so much for this very kind invitation and introduction. I'm very, very pleased to join you today and to present a little snippet of my latest research. I would like also to thank Helen Phelan and again Dr. Vīra-Gupta for the invitation and for organizing this lecture series. And I would also like to thank Shrikara Dattatreya and Neil from the Centre for Islamic Studies in Cambridge for the wonderful support today and in the last couple of weeks. As Dr. Gupta just said, my paper links up with that by Tiziana Lorenzetti 2 weeks ago, but puts the emphasis on the Jainas, whilst Tiziana's paper focused on the Śrī-Vaiṣṇavas. Is this the image on the screen visible well?
Yes, we can hear you and see you perfectly.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So the Jainas experienced a period of great political and cultural flourishing in Karnataka, starting from about the 5th century of the Common Era. In the early 12th century, however, their influence was severely threatened and significantly diminished. This was due both to internal changes within the faith itself, but also to newly formed as well as incoming religious cults. And prominent amongst these were particularly the Vīra-Śaivas, whom we heard about already 2 weeks ago, but also other Shaiva sects, Kalamukas, Śrī-Vaiṣṇavas and Muslims. And as a consequence, the Jainas, as primarily at first the ruling dynasty kind of in the region who was very influenced from the 5th century onwards, then got, one really has to say, deposed, and large sections of the population converted from Jainism to other faiths. Now, my presentation today analyzes the effects which these religious and political changes had on the art and architecture of the Jainas, and to a certain extent also on the art and religion of the new ruling elites. Some Jaina statues, as you can see here on this introductory slide, were destroyed, decapitated, for instance, whilst others were also annexed and reused. However, despite the severe decline in Jaina authority, the faith continued to be practiced and survived. These are kind of the core ideas which I would now like to develop with you in much more detail, but you have an overview over my argumentation. Now, the work I'm presenting is part of a larger research project here at the University of Bonn in the Center of Slavery, Dependency and Slavery Studies, which we commenced together in 2019. And the work I'm presenting today is still work in progress. So I'm very happy to get comments and further suggestions, of course. Now, for those not so familiar with Jainism, the religion, of course, originates in East India, in the state of Bihar, in about the 5th, 6th century BCE. A severe drought, which affected the region during the 4th century BCE, then caused large sections of the community to move away, and they moved largely into the northwest and the south. And this kind of split into these two groups resulted in a schism between the so-called Digambara group of the Jainas, exemplified by the image on the left. And this is largely the form of Jainism we are dealing with in Karnataka. These are the Digambaras, or the sky-clad, the naked wandering monks, and the Shvetambaras, as a photo on the right, as an example of a cotton-clad monk from the north. Legends reflect the introduction of Jainism to Karnataka through the Jaina religious teacher Badra already in the 4th century BCE. This is legendary, but it's interesting that we have very many sites connected with this legend. For instance, here on the top right, we have the so-called Enlightenment cave of Badra, and according to legend, he was accompanied, and this can be seen here down in the bottom right, by Chandragupta Maurya, who allegedly converted to Jainism. I mean, it's heavily disputed, but it's very much alive in Jaina thought and culture in Karnataka still today. And this panel down below here is part of this large screened element here in the Chandragupta Basardi on Chandragiri at Shvanabelgola, which shows 90 panels showing this migration. Now, despite the prominence of this legend, historically, it is actually much more likely that the religion was transmitted from Bihar along the east coast, from Bihar into Orissa, into Tamil Nadu, and that it then entered kind of Karnataka from the southeast only in about the 2nd century of the Common Era. This is what historians believe today. But as you all know, when you go back so far in history, it's often very difficult to provide firm dates. Definitely, what we definitely know is that Jainism became firmly established and proliferated extensively until the 9th century, when it was fully established in Karnataka. And one reason for its popularity appears to have been one subgroup of the Digambara Jainas in Karnataka, known as the Yapaniyas, who were more liberal than conventional Digambara Jainism. Now, after this this initial phase of introduction and consolidation during the early centuries of the Common Era, Jainism flourished intensely and actively till about the 11th, 12th centuries. And this development is kind of illustrated in these images. Here on the top left, you have this early phase. During the early centuries up to the 9th century, we largely have inscriptions here again from Shvanabelgola and line carvings showing, for instance, feet marking the spots of enlightenment of teachers or also devotees, lay people. And then we have a period of wonderful exuberant building phase here, starting with the early mid-9th. For instance, you can see the Chandragupta Basardi here from the mid-9th century, of which we just saw the screens inside, or here at Kambatali, this wonderful Panchakuta Basardi, dating largely from the late 9th Ganga period, with extensions from the 11th and 12th centuries. Now, it was this phase of stability and calm and increased authority under the rule of the Kalyani Chalukyas in the north and the Hoysalas in the south of Karnataka from the early 10th century onwards. And I'm showing you here how the temples evolved and became even more complex. The top two are at Belgaum, below is Halebit. And this period of stability and wealth and influence seems to have motivated the Jaina community to undertake substantial changes in the organization and social outlook of their own religion. This is reflected in the emergence, for instance, of Jaina castes, the elaboration of ritual practices, which become much more evolved, and the establishment of monasteries as permanent seats of learning and land ownership, which Jainism as wandering ascetics should not really have. This is a change in the religion. Now, castes had been absent from the earlier and, let's say, archaic form of the religion, and the fragmentation of the religion into a number of castes and subgroups, such as the Yapanias, whom I just mentioned, which all paid allegiance to different monastic headquarters, the mattas. And here on the left, you can see the Karkal matta. This diminished the unity of the Jaina population because it got fragmented. So this made it easier to split and to disempower the Jaina community. Whether an intensification of ritual practices, such an increase in objects of veneration, as you can see here in these multiple images in the Badra Basardi at Mudabidri, for instance, and the development of Tantric Jainism, further undermined the faith, as some scholars argue, remains questionable. However, I would support the interpretation that it again kind of, to a certain extent, changed or diluted the distinct nature of Jainism, which really in the beginning is its asceticism and its plainness, and that it possibly established closer links to Hindu ritual practices. The originally ascetically minded Jaina religious institutions had amassed enormous wealth and developed into powerful landowners. From the early 12th century, the support of influential royal families in the region declined, and a resentment against the often wealthy and dominant Jaina elite led to confrontations. This then resulted in discrimination and at times in communal violence. Now, in addition to these internal regions, which are really due to the Jainas themselves, also external forces in the form of other religious groups started to threaten the Jainas too. The religion which gained most rapidly in power at this time were the so-called heroic Śaivas, the Vīra-Śaivas, also known as Liṅgāyats, the worshippers of the Linga. As Professor Tiziana Lorenzetti recounted in her presentation 2 weeks ago, Vīra-Śaivism was initiated in northern Karnataka by Basardi, whom we see here on the left, who lived between 1105 and 1168. Now, there is some dispute whether Basardi actually formed the religion anew or whether he reformed an earlier part. There is a question whether Liṅgāyatism is actually older than Vīra-Śaivism, but as Tiziana recounted 2 weeks ago, it's again very difficult to decide. What definitely happened is that Basardi kind of reinitiated, definitely, as if it was a new phase. He gave a lot of impetus to this religion, which from that time on is called Vīra-Śaivism. Now, what we definitely know about the religion is that it's a Bhakti reform movement focusing on the god Shiva. It's a distinct phase and not a subgroup of Hinduism. And this becomes particularly obvious in their rejection of multiple gods. their rejection of the concept of karma, the authority of the Vedas, and the Vīra-Śaivas preach against social inequalities and eliminated caste hierarchies at a time when the Jainas just introduced them. So it's very interesting. Orthodox Vīra-Śaiva supporters reject temple worship, sacrifices, and the concepts of purity and pollution, which play such an important role in, let's say, mainstream Hinduism, even if that is very diverse. The followers worship Shiva here in the form of his symbol, the Linga, which they wear around their neck. Also here Basardi wears it around his neck in what looks more like a cloth bag. It's often a silver casket, but there are also these wonderful elaborate necklaces where containing the Linga with involving Rudraksha beads. Now, in addition, I mean, the Vīra-Śaivas were very prominent in gaining power at this time, but in addition, also local conventional Shaivas, Kalamukas, who are an extreme sect worshipping Bhairava and Kali, gained at this time. In addition to this largely local internal strife, so within Jainism and within the region of Karnataka, where we have Vīra-Śaivas, Shaivas, and Kalamukas increasing in power, there's also kind of new religions coming in from the outside, moving into the area. And these are, for instance, also Śrī-Vaiṣṇavas, who are also Bhakti followers, but not of Shiva, but of Vishnu from Tamil Nadu. They moved into the area from the southeast, from Tamil Nadu. And then we also have, to a certain extent, Muslim migrations, at least from the 13th century, from the north into Karnataka. So as we have seen in the demise of the Jainas, internal changes within the religion as well as external reasons came together. And I'm showing here two more images from a Vīra-Śaiva site at Koppala, the worship of the gurus, and then the gurus also in their samadhis after they've passed away, Vīra-Śaivism as the most important power here in this competition. Now, the importance of Vīra-Śaivas in trade and commerce, which was also already stressed 2 weeks ago, appears to have expedited the swift conversion to the new phase of the ruling Jaina families of landowners and heads of trade guilds. With the conversion of such influential players, such as wealthy landowners, to Vīra-Śaivism and other faith groups, the ordinary population followed suit. And we know this also from other contexts, that if the elite converts, also the local population will convert. And this had catastrophic consequences for the upkeep of Jaina temples and the funding of elaborate ceremonies, as conversions resulted in the withdrawal of financial support away from Jaina centers. Due to the immense significance which temples as religious, economic, and political centers had for the Jaina community, the sacred edifices were usually the first to be targeted in this struggle for religious supremacy in the region. Now, important is that all religious groups were involved in this fight, or all who were involved in this fight for control in the region participated in the destruction, but also in the conversion of Jaina statues and temples. It's not something which is unique to the Vīra-Śaivas. It's just that today we are putting the emphasis on the Vīra-Śaivas because the record, the evidence is particularly interesting, but it's not as if they were worse or more aggressive than others. It was a phase of fight, of various religions fighting for supremacy, which led to a certain amount of violence. Okay, so much to the religious and political background. I would now like to turn with you to the art and architecture. Now, if we look first at the internal changes within the Jaina religion itself, even that already had a marked effect on temple structures. So due to their changed outlook on life and religious practice, which moved from severe asceticism to much more wealth, land ownership, administration. Also, the Jaina edifices were to a certain extent transformed, I would argue. Now, the earlier Jaina temples of the Ganga period, exemplified here on the top by this image of the Jaina temple on Megudi Hill at Aihole from 634, exhibit an almost utilitarian character and reflect a form of the religion which propagated an ascetic lifestyle. However, with an increase in the authority and worldly influence of the Jainas and the growth of monastic institutions as economic centers, the outlook of the religion changed, and also the design of temples. And following this, in the Hoysala period from the 11th to the 14th century, exemplified here down below by this temple, the Shantinatha Basardi at Jinanathapura from the early 12th century, the temples display much more decoration, ornamentation. It's more a celebration of beauty and a more this worldly outlook. Even more marked than these voluntary changes, which the Jainas do themselves without being threatened, even more marked were the influence which Vīra-Śaivism and other denominations had on Jaina temple architecture. Now, starting with the early 12th century, large numbers of Jaina sites were looted and destroyed. And this can often be seen in examples such as this former Jaina temple on the left in Aihole village, where the images were simply removed from their pedestals or altars, and they were kind of left without a focus of attention. So it was actually enough to target these icons for the temples not to be reduced anymore. Now, what is interesting is that there are actually very clearly different approaches in the targeting of these statues. Now, in a first approach, the images were simply removed, as we just said here in Aihole, and we have the empty seats. And this then rendered the temples politically and religiously impotent. So in that case, the temples didn't even need to be destroyed. So this happened, for instance, to the Chandranatishvara Basti at Batkal, which you can see here on the right side. All the images were removed, and although the temple is only very slightly damaged, it was not reconsecrated again. Now, in a second approach, the images were actually left behind. They were not stolen, but they were desecrated. And for this, it actually sufficed to take them from their altars and to place them onto the dusty ground, as happened here in the former Jaina temple at Halur, where the main sacred image has just been set in the hall at the entrance to the temple, visible from the outside. And in a Vīra-Śaiva context, very often the images were then also smeared with ashes, with vibhuti, to signal their annexation. Another way of desecrating the images was to either cut off limbs, arms, or the faces. This is on the outside of the same temple at Halur here, to kind of signal an annexation or conversion. Now, even more powerful, and this is a third approach towards images, I would argue, is the full decapitation of images or icons, as can be seen in these examples here. This is the image in the upper shrine of the hill, the Jaina temple on Megudi Hill, and the one on the right comes from Lakundi. Now, the complete elimination of the head precludes a later reconsecration and prevents devotees from looking at the eyes, which in Jaina ritual is very important. Beheaded figures were frequently displayed at the front of Jaina temples, as can be seen here. So anybody approaching the site immediately had a marker that Jainism was not in control here anymore, that the image had been taken out of the shrine, decapitated and placed on the ground. No, it was a very clear marker. Now, it's very interesting that after the Jainas regained control over some of the sites, maybe in the 15th, 16th centuries, in many cases, they actually left these decapitated statues in place. So they did not restate them or they did not remove them. But here we have a different reason behind it. And this seems, in my view, to be a reminder, like a reminder that of the violence they have suffered, but also survived. This idea of survival, which is then often interpreted as a superiority of the faith, is then you turn kind of a defeat into a victory by using these destroyed images, by saying, okay, you decapitated, you took our religion away, but we have survived and we are here now today. So they are used politically, but in a different way. Now, the disengaged limbs, cut off limbs and heads, as you can see here on the left, were often put in the niches outside temples at first by the Vīra-Śaivas, but later also by the Jainas. And because this idea of reminding people of the violence that was suffered here, it is actually very rare that images get restored. I mean, this is an unusual example from the Panchakuta Basardi at Kambatali, and this restoration of the face, genitals, and the foot was only done in 2018 for the last Mahamastak Abhisheka. But you can see that they're done so crudely and obviously in a different color, that they have been repaired, but it's not kind of whitewashing, it's not kind of eradicating history, it's not trying to pretend that there was never any fight or problem here in the past. At some sites, severely damaged temples were later so we have concentrated on the images, but not only the statues were targeted, but also the temples. And this is shown here in this example on the left. So we said statues were removed or destroyed, and also temple edifices, such as this one here at Halebelgola, were severely damaged. And particularly interesting example is actually the Adinata Basardi at Srirangapatnam, which only dates from the 16th century, but which houses, and I'm showing you a selection here in the two photographs on the right, a selection of the images housed inside, which have all come from demolished temples in the area. So the temples got destroyed and the images were probably scattered or safeguarded in people's homes. And in the 16th century, a new temple was built to house all these images where the temples had been destroyed. At some sites, severely damaged temples were also later rebuilt, and a striking example is visible in these two images here, the Shankarjinalaya at Lakshmeshwar, which is an originally 11th century Kalyani Chalukya site. And you can see here in the close-up on the right, you know, the attack on the temple was so ferocious and the destruction so severe that we only really have small pieces which were fitted together. And a true faithful reconstruction of the temple was really hardly possible. Now, another option chosen by newly dominant factions to express dependencies was for these new groups, for other groups to absorb. Sorry, I'm going too fast because I'm running out of time. I have to slow down. In other instances, only selected building elements, such as here, these door guardians, the Dwarapalas, were reused in destroyed temples, whilst the temples, as here the Mysore city Basardi, which dates largely from the 20th century, are completely new. So destroyed temples were rebuilt by giving them a new attire on the outside, but reusing, as here, for instance, these Hoysala elements. Now, the last approach, which I'm kind of introducing to you today, is not the removal, the destruction, but the complete takeover of temples and images by other groups, so the reuse of sites. And in Karnataka, there are particularly many such examples of the reuse of Jaina shrines from Jaina to Vīra-Śaiva usage. And here again, we can identify three distinct groups, three distinct approaches. And one is where the appropriation is very openly displayed. Then we have temples where this reuse is completely hidden. And then we have examples of a kind of less mindful middle way where you remove certain elements, but the appropriation is still visible. Now, those shrines which advertise really the reuse, as the temple here at Hallur from the 9th century, are reasonably scarce. Here, the Jaina, the statues of the Jaina ascetic, the naked Jinas and Bahubalis have been kept on the outside of the temple. It's today a Vīra-Śaiva shrine, but they have left a little bit on the facade as kind of trophies. You know, you approach the temple and you know immediately this used to be Jaina, even if in the inside we have now the linga, and the main image, as we said before, was just placed at the entrance door. Now, temples where the Jaina origin is less apparent are more numerous. I mean, there are some where all the remnants, the Jaina remnants, were so carefully removed that we really only know through historical documents that this temple was Jaina before. So these are fascinating, but not so very interesting for us as art historians, maybe. I find this middle approach, the third approach, particularly interesting. And this is illustrated by the two temples here in Hangal on the left and Anigeri on the right. And in this instance here, traces of this conversion have been left, but not completely kind of replaced with a new imagery. And this is often visible in the lintels above the doorways leading to the shrines of the temples, where the images decorating the lintels, the lalata bimbas, have been chiseled away. So you can see here these depressions where Lakshmi and Jinas have been carved away. The Makara has been left as a not so clearly denominational ornamental kind of element, but no new images have been carved. So you can only see that the old have been removed and the linga has been placed. Interesting is also a similar case. I mean, the walls of Jaina temples are often quite plain, but we very often have these elaborate decorations and images integrated into the roof structures. This used to be a Jaina temple in Lakundi. It's now known as the Naganatha temple, a Shiva temple. So on the inside, the image of, I would say, Parshvanatha or Suparshvanatha has been removed. It was sheltered by the Naga screen. And a new linga has been placed, which actually goes very well together with the cobra, because that is also associated with the linga. So on the inside, the Jaina iconographic features have quite well been removed, but on the outside, the Jinas are still visible in the roof structure. So these would be examples for the reuse of sacred Jaina spaces. Now, rarer than this is the annexation of images or objects of veneration. However, also here we have very interesting examples, and particularly fascinating is that also Vīra-Śaivas, whose tenets, of course, reject image veneration besides that of the linga, they also absorbed and continue to venerate Jaina statues and symbols. So here we have on the left from Adagunchi a Jina, who again has been converted. You can see this by this vibhuti markings and the garland. This Jina today is referred to as Dodappa, which in Kannada means paternal uncle, because there is no divinity which could be substituted or could be, reinterpreted really. And also the feet, the padukas of the Jina outside the temple have been marked and annexed. Now this below here is very interesting. These are Jaina Kshetrapalas from Kagvat in Karnataka, which have been converted. The temple was converted, and also these images were converted to represent Shiva, which of course the Vīra-Śaivas don't normally venerate in figural form. Now, literary evidence and colonial reports indicate continued discrimination against the Jainas in Karnataka well into the 19th century. However, despite this, Jainism and Jaina art and architecture never really ceased to develop, but it was often reduced to certain centers. So for instance, Hampi, on the top left here, exemplified by the Ganagiti temple at neighboring Kamalapuram from 1385, or there's the center of Shravana-Belgola down below, exemplified by the Mangai Basti dating to 1325. And then also, of course, the west coast of India, on which I'm particular which fond of, is exemplified here on the right by the Chandranatha Basardi at Mudabidri, dating from as late as 1429. So we have these royal, these religious, and these provincial centers where Jainism develops, keeps going, and then expands. Now, it's interesting that even in the north of Karnataka, where we have the strongest Vīra-Śaiva and also Muslim dominance, also here we have examples from Bagalkot, where Jainism survived. And this is particularly enhanced by a movement of Shvetambaras from the early 20th century, but particularly during the last 40 to 60 years into the area of Karnataka. So this temple here on the top right at Gadak was founded in 1914. And the image on the bottom right, which shows ongoing constructions close to Bangalore, show that, you know, also today there is a great expanse of new temples, particularly interestingly by these Mavari Jainas moving into the region, continuing the expansion of Jainism. So to conclude, the situation I've outlined in my presentation today shows very complex relationships and interactions between different religious groups in Karnataka. This was particularly pronounced during the period between the 12th and the 15th centuries, but in many areas continued well beyond it. Jainism was only one of many beliefs in a system of interrelated faith communities who were all competing for an increase in their following and for religious, political, and financial influence. Due to changes undertaken in their own religious structure at first, during a period in which they found themselves in a situation of strength, Jainism appears to have become more susceptible to criticism and competition. Through these modifications, Vīra-Śaivas in particular were able to gain power and to relegate the Jaina community to a position of strong dependency in Karnataka. Despite this period of severe persecution, which I've outlined in this paper, Jainism survived at a number of sites and succeeded to endure. As such, the Jainas managed from a situation of initial superiority to plunge into extreme dependency. However, after a time of harsh decimation and difficulty, they successfully survived as a vibrant religious tradition with an ongoing artistic and architectural development throughout the region to the present day. And the last photograph I'm showing you just shows that even today, when people farmers plow their fields, often images, Jain images are brought up. And they're put on display and very, very quickly, even today, immediately annexed by the Vīra-Śaiva, who are usually still the largest group in the village. So we have no outright discrimination anymore, but it's interesting that, you know, it's obviously a Jaina, a Bahubali statue here, but this annexation and this fight for control, which I think here has more to do with the ownership of land, which is threatened by these images, continues. Thank you very much for your attention. And
thank you, Professor Hegewald. Yeah. Now I will invite Dr. Tiziana Lorenzetti to engage with you on this, on your lecture. So Tiziana, would you like to speak or start asking some questions?
Yes, I also wrote my first question, as you told me, Vivek, First of all, thank you, Julia, Professor Hegewald, for your lecture. And it gives me the opportunity to clarify very briefly a point of my last talk that I had not time to develop properly. And, you rightly said that Basava was, there are many, a number of theories about the origin of the Liṅgāyats Vīra-Śaiva. The most popular as that Basava was the founder or the reviver of a previous movement. But there is another minority tradition that connected the Liṅgāyat, the Liṅgāyat origin or Vīra-Śaiva origin to a lineage of 5 masters, Acharya, who had lived in Karnataka in mythical times. Of course, it's very difficult to go back to this ancient period and to detach this tradition to the most popular tradition. But this tradition is also very important because it is different. It is different in rituality, and very important if you wanted to understand why the Vīra-Śaiva at a certain point started to build temples of their own. And then we go back to my first question that is also written. If you would like to read my question.
No, you can do it, Tiziana. Okay. It's okay now, I think.
Okay. You very nicely showed that the Vīra-Śaiva destroyed the temples and the Jain images, destroyed or desecrated the Jain images. But I also personally noticed that in a few temples, the Jain images, maybe 1 or 2, not more, happen to have been saved completely intact. Do you know that this was this a deliberately act? And do you know the meaning to why these few images happen to have been saved?
You mean the main icon of the temple, or like decorations? Decorations, yes. Yes, it's a bit like the example from the Naganatha temple at Lakundi, which I showed, where inside they've quite carefully removed all iconographic remnants, but on the outside they left the small images. It's interesting, we find a similar situation, for instance, in the early Islamic architecture in India, for instance, in the Qatul Islam Masjid, where at the main prayer hall and in the arcades on the inside to the court, the images were all chiseled away. But if you walk through the arcading and look from the other side, there often are still images. And I guess one wonders, is it carelessness? It doesn't sort of matter so much? I mean, in the main sacred compartment area where the ritual is taking place, all traces are removed, and towards the outside or the edges, it's not quite so important. But I'm also wondering, because this, whether it's not sometimes also a little bit of a political message here of reminding of not completely, as I said, eradicating all traces, but also playing a little bit with the victory of being the stronger. And it's not meant in an evil way, but, you know, it was a struggle for survival, and, you know, once one survived and sometimes the others. But I guess it's kind of a mixture of being casual, of being a little bit careless, not minding so much, and partially also using these remnants as kind of a political message of power. Both, I would say, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I would like to ask you one more question.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that maybe there are some more questions from some other for the audience, so I can.
But go ahead. I think one more is fine.
Maybe this is a very unusual question, and forgive me for this, but I thought a lot regarding these things. You know, we all know, okay, and the Jaina Vīra-Śaiva encounter was very very strong. There were a lot of fights and very violent, and the Vīra-Śaiva destroyed not only the temples, but they physically destroyed many devotees, Jain devotees. And apart from these violent interreligious contracts, what do you think? Did the Jain Vīra-Śaiva interaction reveal also certain positive elements? We know that from the history that when there is a meeting of two different creeds, some things good for Jains, of course, for the loser, could happen.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if you.
Yes. Absolutely fine. I mean, I think we agree that the negative, the harm is very obvious with disposing political power, trade power, even killings. But I think that this was also particularly pronounced during the early periods. You know, it's also when Islam arrives in India, it's much more forceful, and then it becomes more integrative. And I think that's also with the Vīra-Śaivas. In the beginning, it's really a struggle for survival, and then you calm down to a certain extent. It's not quite so. I mean, it's of course more than just a discussion between religious concepts, but yes, of course one can. I guess out of every situation we can also gain something positive. I mean, there are, for instance, I'm only aware of one site, but I'm sure there will be others, where Jainas and Vīra-Śaivas today worship parallel in the same edifice. And this is, for instance, the case at Hegewald, where the destruction of the temple is blamed on the Muslims. I don't know if this is really true. We can't really check it. But this seems to make it easier for the Jainas and the Vīra-Śaivas to blame an outside group and to then worship. It's kind of a syncretic temple where the Vīra-Śaivas worship on the ground floor and the Jainas have subterranean levels of the temple. So there is a certain amount of coming together, possibly at certain sites. We could also argue that by not completely destroying all temples and smashing all images, the Vīra-Śaivas also kept Jaina culture alive for us to study, but also as a kind of part of Indian culture. We could maybe also argue that by absorbing Jain images, the Vīra-Śaivas, who were really quite radical in rejecting images, a very ascetic, radical religion, by absorbing parts, the Jainas influenced Vīra-Śaivism and made it maybe slightly less radical. You know, it formed the way to more image veneration in Vīra-Śaivism as well. And then it's actually you who has worked so much on similarities between Vīra-Śaivas and Jainas, and you are actually better positioned to answer this. But I remember that you pointed out similarities in kind of making donations or using local languages. I don't know, maybe you could add a few points on that side to the debate. Do you want to do that? Mention some of the similarities? I know you've worked in particular on those.
At the very beginning,
yes.
There were a lot of similarity, and I personally think that this similarity were one of the reason why we have this big amount of conversions, because there were some similarity at the beginning. The rejection of castes, rejections of certain rituals performed by Brahmins, and the deep meditation. And there were similarities.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, we could go on.
Sorry.
So now I will invite Professor Pika Ghosh to ask a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tiziana, for engaging
Julia.
Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tiziana.
Pika?
No.
No sound.
Oh, hold on. We have to ask to unmute her.
Your microphone is mute. Okay.
She's now.
Thank you for unmuting me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Hegewald, that was wonderful. I thought, I followed your work for a long time. I'm a huge fan, but the political significance of what you're doing now is tremendous for those of us who are of South Asian background in this, in the current climate of South Asia. And as thinking back to all these ranges of case studies, like particularly from my own interest in working on Eastern India, the Hindu-Muslim complexity and the creative co-options of earlier material, right? We tried to talk about non-violent, right? The effort of the 90s post-Godra was to talk about non-violent creative commitments, but to lay out what was going on in this southern Indian belt as equally competitive among, these competing constituencies was marvelous. Watch in the range. It actually reminds me, and I do believe, because I work in that western end of Bengal near in that Purulia, Jharkhand area.
Yeah.
I've seen many images where it distinctly looks like a Jinnah being converted into a Vishnu.
Yes.
I mean, chisel for arms, and him, where Rishabhnath becomes. But my sense was that those were, they looked, and because I have never looked at Jain sculpture, I would be embarrassed to admit, I would not be able to tell whether it was 12th, 13th, or 14th century, right? It looked like late Pala to me, figures that were clearly at a much more recent date, incised. And so my guess was to go back to thinking about Richard Davis and how the Didaga Jiangshi gets a new life, right, in the 20th century. Because these things are in worship under trees as Hindu, and it's a Vaishnava belt, right? Gaudiya Vaishnavism is huge. But thinking through that, maybe, how do we know, like, the dating of these political co-options? And it really struck me when you showed us that one image on a temple wall where a particular Jinnah was given a white face, the genitals, and the 1 foot, right? Like, what kind of a dating would you suggest for that particular co-option, for example, right? And are we talking about a colonial period intervention upon earlier ones? What kind of conservation choices have been made in the last 150 years as this Jain community is mobilizing and incredibly wealthy, right, in its presence in that belt? What are their investments? How does the archaeological survey intervene at such sites? So if you could speak a little sort of to the biographical approach of these monuments and sculptures.
The image you referred to, which had actually been restored, which is quite rare, comes from the Panchakuta Basardi at Kambatali, and the site was started in the kind of late 9th century, but has already additions from the 10th, 11th, 11th, 10th to 12th centuries. The restoration, we know, was actually only done in 2018. I mean, that's what I was told, at least on the site. It's very, very recent and very, very rare. And it's interesting because I think it might show, maybe due to what you mentioned as the Jaina community being in certain areas, again, very influential or wealthy, and having, of course, the financial resources to restore. And I think there is sort of, one is torn, on the one side, one could make it all look beautiful and one could forget the past, but somehow the past is reused is used politically, you kind of almost make your religion stronger and more important because you were targeted and you survived. And this shows that you are right and that you are superior. This is what often is said, at least narrated locally. So I think the scarred nature is important politically for these communities. So they wouldn't eradicate it completely. So you do a half restoration. You know, we of course in the West today also wouldn't restore in a way that you couldn't, you know, you should show what has been restored, what is new, what is old. But I don't think it's a question of authenticity. It's more of reminding people of the past. They have the money to restore and repair, but they do not want to completely forget history. But in this case, it's very recent, I would say. I mean, the damage was done, I would say, in the 12th, 13th century.
So the claim then is made almost 1,000 years later. Is that your sense? I mean, are we suggesting a gap in the historical record?
The kind of repair. I mean, the site, I think, was used before, but for instance, at Lakshmeshwar, this heavily destroyed Anantanata temple, for instance, today is Jaina again, but on the outside in the niches are still the chopped off limbs and heads of Jainas, which were violated. So it is in Jaina use, and you visit the site and you think it's all normal, and they take you around and they tell you what happened here. You know, it's still very much part of the narration.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems like the ethnographic record is really interesting.
Yeah.
Then, right? And the folkloristic remembering of the past and claiming it of the past is a huge deal. But then, you know, I mean, are we saying then that we are seeing something of really European or Euro-American conservation approaches adding more complexity? If these are 20th and 21st century claims, as opposed to this is how a 16th century Jain community reclaimed its headless sculpture and flaunted it on the front steps. Do you know what I mean?
So just
you know what I'm saying? Are we saying a much more layered political history with the intervention of Western approaches?
Pika, let's let that question linger because it relates to another question by Catherine Kasdorf. Catherine, I invite you to unmute yourself. And are you? Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Julia, for a fabulous lecture. I've also been fascinated by these changes in images and temples for many, many years. And I've noticed many of the examples that you discussed also. I really liked how you fleshed out all of these different ways that Jain temples and Jain images have been changed over time and thought about the different agents behind those changes. And as I wrote in the comments, I was especially struck by that example. I think it was an Aihole of the empty Jain pedestal. And you connected that object to a period starting in the early 12th century when you were discussing Jain temples being looted or destroyed. And I'm wondering if, you know, what's the evidence that that lets you sort of pin that to that early period? Certainly, you know, there's plenty of evidence for Jain temples losing patronage starting that period of time, as you showed very convincingly. But I was wondering if the change to that temple and maybe to other temples could have been more gradual, you know, as temples were abandoned and you know, in some cases, images were clearly deliberately destroyed. But in this case where an image was removed, I wonder if that removal might have happened much, much later as these sculptures started to be viewed as art objects and they started to be removed for display in museums and collected. And, you know, I wonder if in some of these cases where the images are simply missing, if that might be what's going on.
Yeah.
say about
You're
that.
absolutely right. Thank you very much for making that point. It's very, very, I mean, we have very little information on the actual happenings, even at the sites. I mean, people locally, you know, will recount stories and tell you who removed what. Sometimes it's not even clear, even if you ask, you know, who or what happened here. It's often difficult to pinpoint, and yes, of course, I can't say that they were all taken immediately in the early or mid or later 12th century. And as you rightly say, probably various things come together here. We have a couple of interesting, even colonial reports from the sort of late 18th, 19th, well, sort of 19th, early 20th century kind of, well, yes, spreading out, or cousins, or, you know, early engineers traveling who, when they return to a temple, suddenly say an image is gone, or it has been removed by people just smashing up the temple. You're absolutely right. And I'm actually working on a larger book publication on this topic, and I want to go into more detail where I have it. Yes, I fully agree. It is too simplistic to say they were all destroyed or taken by the Vīra-Śaivas in the 12th, 13th century. It's just very difficult. I mean, we are very lucky when we have more precise information at a site. I mean, there are even Jainas and quite renowned art historians who, when you ask them, say Jainism has never been under attack. The Jainas have always been victorious. We have never experienced any problems. And you write a book about nothing, you know. It's a very political, it's a very sensitive topic kind of for everybody involved. And I definitely don't want to blame anybody or blame anybody more than others. I think what I want to show is, with distance, how interesting these encounters and struggles are, and that once one religion and then again another religion dominates, and how it's this constant change and readjusting which has led to frightening violence, but also to, as Tiziana indicated in her question, also to very, very good things, people coming together, and one continues living together, and one continues to reuse and be influenced. So it's not, my aim is not to point the finger at let's say, the Vīra-Śaivas. The emphasis was just on them because Tiziana and I had taken that kind of focus. But the Jainas also reused Hindu temples, for instance, at Khajuraho. It's something every religion has done, Christianity, everybody. And I see actually quite interesting and positive nuances in it, because it's much better than destroying and, you know, blowing up the Bamiyan Buddhas and putting, you know, producing just rubble, because these objects stay as part of culture and tradition, and people react to them, and you copy them, and you have a story, and maybe they're returned, and, you know, whether they're accepted or not is again, but it makes this wonderful, I mean, it makes history alive. It continues, it always goes on, and it's never at an end. And yes, although there was a lot of destruction, I hope that it has also become clear, yes, how these religions, like a kind of clockwork, kind of work together, and you know, one religion is on top, and then it's another, and it continues, and it's all part of a cultural history. But yes, where I have more information, I will be more specific. And you're right that some sites also, let's say, you know, we have villages where almost all Jain families converted, and the sites just decayed out of neglect. And I can very well imagine that then such images could easily be absorbed by traders or museums, or, you know, traded abroad. And yes, I'm grateful for this hint to look more into that and to search more for those information. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that fantastic question. And I am just going to pool a number of questions now that we have. We have questions from Arvind Sethi, Kevin Fernandez, and Nick Barnard. And the general gist of these questions is to think, and something that was actually also on my mind while you were speaking, is a general idea of whether or not we have an understanding of the system or the values that went into destroying certain kinds of destruction. So is there a way that you can tell that this may have been done by a Muslim community or by a Hindu community or another, like, are there systematic approaches to we can call it destruction, but also reuse? We can also think of it as Jinodhara. We can think about it in many different ways. So I do wonder whether or not you have an idea based on the evidence. And I know that that's very difficult because thinking about reuse is often there's no system or logic to it, and the material record is very spotty. But are there any cases that lead you in the direction of saying, oh yes, this is the approach that was taken here and it was done by this community for this reason?
I would argue, but again, it's often difficult because we have only very few examples where we know historically really what have happened. I would say that all religions involved, and these are the Vīra-Śaivas, other Shaiva groups, Kalamukas, Śrī-Vaiṣṇavas and Muslims, in my view, use all the techniques. Interesting with regard, I've worked on the Parshvanatha temple at Khajuraho, where I think proven quite on the evidence that this definitely was a Hindu temple before, and the Jainas, because they, as one of their main tenets is ahimsa, not harming, not damaging, they have taken incredible care to eradicate all traces. They really they wanted people to believe that this was a Jaina temple beforehand, although there are clear indications that this probably was not the case. Whilst for other religious groups, I think it's not so. Let's say for the Vīra-Śaivas, if the Vīra-Śaivas who reformed only in the early 12th century absorbed a 9th century temple, there was no need to be so persistent in eradicating all changes, because Vīra-Śaivism in that form did not exist in the 9th century. So arguing that it had been built by the Vīra-Śaivas, was not necessary. It kind of was clear. But I wouldn't say that necessarily, I mean, the Vīra-Śaivas, for instance, really destroyed, they defaced, but they also reused and they kept images. And it's probably more the politics, the specific situation in the village. I mean, did the village convert quite freely anyway, then probably not much destruction was necessary, or when did it happen? I wouldn't say that we can say Vīra-Śaivas always decapitate or always destroy or smash, or Muslims do so. It's very mixed, I find, and it seems to depend on the local situation, the particular situation. That's at least my feeling. Have you got?
Yeah, and I think
feeling?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in some of the Muslim cases, there are certain logics to how pillars are used, or where pillars are placed, how they're sort of taken. But speaking of reuse is very complicated, and I think that's why certain kinds of scholars gravitate towards it. So as a subject on its own.
Yeah.
But anyways, this has been a really exciting lecture, Professor Hegewald. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you, Dr. Lorenzetti, for sharing your thoughts. So please join me in thanking Professor Julia Hegewald for this fantastic lecture. Thank you so much. And this was her second lecture in our series, so we're extra grateful to you for doing this. It takes a lot of work to prepare these, so thank you so much, and we look forward to reading and really using your publications in the future. We had quite a few fans of yours in this lecture. So our next event will be Arthur Milner on June 17th at 1 p.m. London time, who will be speaking on the topic of a cosmopolitan yet local tradition, glazed tiles in the Deccan Sultanates. Thank you very much and have a good weekend. Thank you.